My name is Alex Murray, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities to their involvement. If you're a student and you'd like to join, anybody, you can contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. After the presentation, we'll have some time for some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker will come around with the microphone to you. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers, and we'll help you out. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you all to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming our presenter this afternoon. Thank you.
I didn't hear the end of your announcement. Okay. Very good. Thank you all for coming out today. We very much appreciate you coming out on a dreary day to hear about what is a fascinating topic. I am not going to give Professor Hal Wert, a long introduction. I like short introductions, and so I am not going to dwell on his extraordinary qualifications, but I would point you to his bio that is on the program that you probably received when you came in if you want to know a little bit more about him. But I do want to say that I've been at the Dole Institute for 14 years, and Hal was one of the very first guests I recruited to come to the Dole Institute. He was part of a series we did in the summer of '05. So he and I go back probably a little bit longer than either of us care to admit, and I'm not sure how I found out about your book. Was it Ted Wilson? I know Ted Wilson, who probably many of you know is a professor emeritus of history here at KU, has done a lot with the Dole Institute, and I do believe Hal was one of those. So, Hal, it is great to have you back. He spoke 14 years ago, I don't know, that would be 13 years ago, on his book, Hoover, the Fishing President, and it was fantastic, and he just shared with me that book is coming out in paperback. And I don't know if you will talk about this at all, but your current project is a book about Hoover and Roosevelt. And so I've already petitioned him when he gets that book done to come back to the Dole Institute so he can once again share some of those stories. So Hal has been very, very widely published. As I said, you can read a lot more about him in his bio. He has a BA from the University of Iowa, PhD from KU. He's an emeritus professor of history at the KC Art Institute, and we're delighted to have him back. Please welcome Professor Hal Wert. Hal?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Because can I take my coat off? No. Okay. That's all right. We'll do that. You know, I was before we get started here, I was in the post office yesterday, and I'd ordered some Putin calendars from Russia. And, well, they're just too good. I had to have them. So I'd ordered 3, and when I went to the post office, people there know me because I usually get posters. And so the guy in the post office said, "Is this a poster?" And I said, "No, it's a package from Russia." And the place was crowded, and they said, "What's in there?" And I said, "My absentee ballot." Never mind. So see, nobody has a sense of humor anymore. Everybody in the post office laughed, so they didn't lynch me. I was at least pleased about that. But we'll get started. Oh, and the Hoover book is coming back out in paperback through the same press. It's actually through Rowman and Littlefield. And I think I do have a publisher for the Hoover-Roosevelt book, but I'm not sure yet. I think I'm always teasing Mary about this. This is probably the last book I'll do before my impending death, so I want the very best publisher I can possibly get. We'll see. Maybe make a little money. But you might take a look, if you're interested in posters, on my Hope book, which is a collection of Obama posters and prints. And then I have one on McGovern and McCarthy from the 1960s. I can tell you how divided America is because when I did the Hoover book, lots of my friends said, "How in the hell can you do a book on Herbert Hoover?" And when I did the McGovern and Obama book, other friends said, "How the devil can you possibly do a book on Obama?" So I've worked both sides of the fence. And at book signings, too. On the Kansas side, the Hoover book sold really well. On the Missouri side, not so well. The Hope book on the Democratic side, so on the Missouri side, sold really well, but not so well on the Kansas side. So you get the idea. We've been divided for a long time. Let's talk about World War II and posters. I'm not going to burden you with them, but I have 513 images Mary knows this, of posters and photographs from the relief efforts during the war. And nobody's ever done a book on this. Maybe I'll get it. I think KU Press is looking at it right now, and we'll see what happens with it. But you know, it's a complicated story. And we can start really in 1939. 1939 is really the year that all the chickens came home to roost. All of the problems and difficulties that have been manifesting themselves with Mussolini, Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War, Hitler, Sudetenland, all came to roost in 1939. And on March 15th, the Munich Agreement was broken by Hitler, and then just a few months later, September 1st, 1939, the war starts. But before that, there had been substantial relief efforts, and there had been large numbers of refugees in Europe, starting right before World War I with the Balkan Wars, and then afterwards through the 1920s and 30s, there were still lots of refugees. And France was probably the best country in the world about taking in refugees in the 1930s. A tremendous number from Italy and a tremendous number from the Spanish Civil War. So there were considerable relief efforts. United China Relief had been raising money since the mid-1930s. So even before the National War Fund, or before Americans got into it on a big-time basis, from about 1933 to 1939, $75 million had been raised to help with refugees in various parts of the world. But 1939 is going to really crank that effort. If we go back one here and start, we're going to talk about images first for a while, and all of these images I've had shot at 300 ppi or better. This is the CIO did quite a bit of work with refugees throughout the war and after, and labor unions were extremely active. This poster is by a very famous black illustrator and artist by the name of Norman Lewis. We wanted this poster for the show Work, Fight, Give that's on the road right now. I have 2 national traveling poster shows out, and Work, Fight, Give just opened 3 days ago at the Silent Wings Museum in Lubbock, Texas. And then Sign of the Times, the poster show, the political poster show, is in Reading, Pennsylvania. We wanted this poster for the show, but I didn't have it. It's a rare poster. And I've only had it for about 6 months, so I was very pleased to have it and be able to talk about it today. Let's take a look here. I like this poster too. This is by Perland, who's another famous artist and illustrator from the Second World War. He did probably 8 or 9 World War II relief posters of various kinds. I'm very fond of, I'm actually very fond of most of them, so I probably shouldn't say that. But we're going to do famous artists for a minute. Anybody know who did this poster? Have any idea who might have done this poster? Rockwell Kent, who is a very famous American illustrator and artist, left-winger, New York City, New England. I don't know, this is a strange poster, but I like it. But it's from the Spanish Civil War. It exists, too, in an orange version. And the orange version is extremely rare. The only place there's a copy left is in SUNY Plattsburgh, is the only place I know that this poster exists in the orange copy. This one, too, was actually used not only by international lady garment workers, but also by the American Communist Party. And I have a photograph of it being used by communists on strike in Minneapolis in the late 1930s. This poster was probably done about 1937. And you can see it's got the typical propaganda. You know, propaganda posters love spiders, rats, snakes, anything that's disagreeable to make a good propaganda poster. I've always been, this comes too in 2 or 3 different colors and was run by two or three different organizations. The artist that did this is named Loeb, Jewish artist, famous illustrator. Everybody knows who did this one, James Montgomery Flagg. Everybody knows his World War I Uncle Sam. Probably the poster that's been ripped off by more people and more organizations than any poster in the history of American poster making. Flagg started his posters in World War I, where he dressed himself up in an Uncle Sam suit and used himself as a model. He's an extremely interesting guy. He's from St. Louis. He got his first commissions when he was 12 years old and worked for St. Louis newspapers. Then he married an extremely wealthy St. Louis heiress who supported him for most of his life. If he were alive today, though, he would definitely be a victim of the Me Too movement. He loved, I think more in the biblical sense, almost all of his models. And he had a tremendous number of models over a long period of time. But he's an extremely interesting person. Anybody know who the star is? Loretta Young. Who said Loretta Young? You win. The people, when they had their posters made, each of the organizations, as the war began to swing into gear, tried to pick poster makers that were famous artists, and then they became the face of that organization. So, United China Relief was really fond of Flagg, and we'll look at other organizations that pick different artists, and they become the face, really, of those relief effort movements. Now, let's back up just a little bit and talk about what happens. Once the war started, Americans tend to be extremely generous human beings, and so numbers of people started their own relief organizations. They could be anything from, let's say, a big Polish organization in Chicago or New York, or even local churches. So by the summer of 1940, there were almost 500 relief organizations, kind of like the NGO problem today. I read an article recently that there are over 100 NGOs in Cambodia. And so this was a level of chaos. And in World War II, there had been this same level of chaos, and the Wilson administration had decided that they needed to register and then allowed them to proceed. But Franklin Roosevelt decided in 1942 that not only did they need to register, which they did, but they needed to consolidate, and that they would run one national campaign a year where all of the relief organizations participated, and it would be in the fall of 1943, 44, 45, and 46, and then they didn't do it in 47, and then each one would submit a budget, and they divide up the pool on however much money was raised. So it would be a one-time deal nationwide. All of the relief agencies got to publish their own posters, and they also submitted them then to the National War Fund, which it was called, that published most of them in standard formats like 11 by 17 or 24 by 36. But there's lots of them in different sizes. Nobody knows how many posters. It's interesting, too, that some of the relief organizations that were very prominent did not want to participate in the National War Fund. They could stay independent. We'll talk a little bit later about Bundles for Britain. Bundles for Britain never participated. They maintained their independence, but the British War Fund did. But these people had to consolidate. So let's say there were about 15 or 16 Polish organizations. These became battles within the relief organizations. Who was going to run them? Who was going to have control of them? The Chicago Poles won. The New York Poles did not participate in the National War Fund. So, and you can imagine, too, I think all of the politics of World War II will really affect the relief organizations. In many ways, World War II is both a civil war between the left and the right. And you can see that particularly in France and in post-war France. You can see that, of course, in the Spanish Civil War. In Yugoslavia. What happens in Yugoslavia when we had been supporting the Royal Yugoslav government? Churchill decides to support Tito. There's a switch in the middle. What does that do to relief organizations in America? Well, what it did is touch off internecine warfare within the relief organizations for who was going to control them and who was going to get the money in the countries. It's also true that lots of the money that was raised could not be used in the countries for which it was intended because they were occupied by the Nazis. So in fact, what they did is deal with refugees, people that were in the diaspora from the various ethnic groups in Europe, and help them if they were in Canada, America, South America, And you know, there was a great big debate during the war about who would take refugees. We don't debate that these days, do we? If we were going to take refugees and where they would go and who would provide for them. So lots of that money was actually used for those kinds of things and to help people get out of Europe. Ex-President Hoover wanted to do the same thing he'd done in World War I, which was feed the Belgians when they were occupied by the Germans in northern France as well. And he fought Roosevelt through most of World War II to be able to do that. Roosevelt said no, he'd support the British blockade, which meant the peoples of Europe could not be fed when they were under German occupation. Roosevelt and Churchill, when they made that concession, decided on that policy, only ever deviated from it once during World War II. The Greeks in the winter of 1940-41 and on into 42, the death rate in Athens was as high as almost 50,000 a month in Greece from starvation. Hoover complained. Others complained radically about it, and it was decided they would go ahead and open the blockade to feed Greece during the war while it was under German occupation. It was done by the International Red Cross. They put 12 ships of the line moving between Canada, although we sent lots of material to Canada that went on those ships, and then it went to Greece. All during the war, only one time somebody sunk one of those ships. They were lit up at night and had Swedish Red Cross all down the side, but somebody's submarine, nobody will admit who did it, sunk one of the ships. But the Greeks were fed. The Germans did not steal the food that was sent to Greece. They stole all the other food in Greece, but they didn't steal any of the relief food. So it was possible to be able to feed people. Roosevelt and Churchill decided that was too cumbersome for Norway or for Poland or too cumbersome for France or Belgium, and the idea was the quickest way to help the people of Europe is to win the war. It's exactly the same reason we didn't bomb Auschwitz. The appeals to bomb Auschwitz and to try to do something in Poland was the quickest way to save the Jews in Europe that were left was to win the war as quickly as possible. And the only deviation from that policy is for Greek relief. Let's go on and take a look here. Martha Sawyers was a famous illustrator and also a famous war correspondent during the war that ended up in the Pacific. And along with Flag, she became the face of United China Relief. And United China Relief was heavily dominated by Republicans. Right after his defeat by Roosevelt in 1940, Wendell Willkie became the chairman of United China Relief. And it's not clear what Willkie would do after that, but in any event. And then one of the big contributors was the Luce family from Life magazine. They were really big in China Relief. This is also the other famous Martha Sawyers poster. This is a window card, but they made window cards, they made subway cards, they made different size posters. United China Relief even made billboards. I've never seen a billboard for Polish Relief, but for China Relief, yes. And China Relief, amazingly, during the whole period from about 1933 to 1949 when the communists took over, raised more money for relief than any other organization. More than went to Great Britain. Now, not Lend-Lease aid, but relief aid was raised for China. And China, in the 1930s, had 22 women's universities. And those universities were sponsored to a high degree both by American Christian organizations and by United China Relief as sort of refugee centers. I think you'll all like this. I'm not sure this is today politically correct, but nonetheless, how many of you have seen Fantasia? And know, what's this character's name? Anybody know? Hoplo? Does anybody know the little mushroom is Hoplo? But Disney did this, and then they did a program through grade schools throughout America to raise money for United China Relief, and had little Cinderella stamps. You know, the little stamps that are non-postage are called Cinderellas, and little kids could paste them in and can contribute 5 cents or 10 cents to United China Relief. So this was never really done as a full poster. It mostly appeared as an advertisement in Life magazine. Well, you might guess that's a loose publication. So that's where it appeared almost all the time. Notice, too, what I should point out, that some of the posters I've showed you so far do not say National War Fund on them. And the reason they don't is there's no National War Fund until late 1942. So these are earlier relief posters. This is one of the first ones that came out in 1939 for Polish relief. This is a very rare poster. But we'll talk about this a little later. You know, some of the posters, the iconography speaks particularly to the ethnic group that they're trying to raise money for. And this, of course, you know, Poles are, these days, 90% Catholic. Were then too, although Poland had huge minority groups before World War II, and after World War II, they don't. Because, you know, the Jews in Poland were essentially killed. I should just deviate for a quick minute, but in Holocaust studies, which I'm very close to a lot of people in Holocaust studies and belong to the Jewish Educational Organization in Kansas City, and we have seminars 4 times a year. And the Holocaust has really moved from the death camps to the Wehrmacht and what's going on in Eastern Europe before there were gas chambers. And also, the emphasis on German Jews has really captured historians, and the movement now is to really look big at what went on with Polish Jews and how threatened they were, and did they immigrate to Palestine, and what were the problems they faced. And the problems they faced were very similar to the ones that were faced by the Jews in Germany. Because after Piłsudski died in 1935, Poland really didn't have a strong government, and there was a Polish fascist movement that was pretty powerful that challenged the government. So they were threatened too. But in any event, what the point is here, though, that on Poland, the Jews were mostly murdered. Most of the 3 million Jews in Poland were murdered during the Holocaust. 400,000 did go to Palestine up through 1939. And then, of course, the Ukrainians and the Belarusians were taken over by the Russians, and then as the Poles moved forward, the communist Poles with the Russian army, they drove all the Germans out. So at the end of the war, there's no Jewish minority, there's no Russian or Belarusian or Ukrainian minority, and there's no German minority. Poland is, for the first time, as Wilson would say, the self-determined, I thought this is self-determination of nations on a very cruel basis. Poland is 90-some% Catholic and 90-some% Polish. But the way they got there is one of the great tragedies. You know, Norman Davis's book is one of the best on Polish history, and it's called God's Playground, which I think is an apt term to think about Poland. There's 2 areas, areas we need to sort of cry for. One was historically Poland, the other is the Ukraine, and still the Ukraine, and the other is Russia. Russia only briefly had a window of opportunity to have a democratic government in a 3 or 4 year period clear back to Ivan the Terrible. So we should have a moment, I think, of almost silence for God help the Ukraine and God help the Russians. Let's talk about this. This is by W.T. Benda. W.T. Benda was a great World War I illustrator, and you can tell he's older than. He's a famous illustrator, mask maker, and did lots of really fascinating artistic projects. He immigrated from Poland about 1903, 1904. But look, the airplanes are a little dated for World War II. But I think, I love this poster. I think it's a beautiful poster, and it's big. Most of the Benda posters are 36 by 48. They're really big sized. I've got 14 of them. I need more wall space. But who understands the iconography? I mean, every Pole, the minute they see this poster, even now, knows exactly what's going on. And the only one, I'm going to give Mary a chance. Mary, what's going on? They're what? Yeah, they're the hussars in Poland that actually did wear eagle feathers on their back, but they defeated the Muslims in 1683 outside of Vienna. They were the main force that charged the center of Suleiman's line and supposedly, theoretically here, saved Western Europe from the Muslims. As you know, they've been coming up the Danubian River forever. Romania, parts of Serbia, You know that. Hungary was captured in 1524 at the Battle of Mohacs. And Romania was all under Muslim rule. So these are the hussars, and of course the hussars the horses did not have wings. But at the battle, these were like, how many of you know the Stuka, when it dove, the Stuka dive bomber screamed and made a terrible noise. It wasn't very accurate and wasn't very effective militarily, but as a terror weapon it was really good. When these horses charged at a full gallop, say 1,500 of them with the eagle feathers on it, a full thing, the wind whistled through them for a terrifying scream, which supposedly made the Muslims pee their pants, essentially. The idea. And they charged the center of the line, which is always a risky military strategy, because if you don't do it, the right and the left are going to fold on you. And that's what happened to Mohacs. They charged the center of the line, and the left and the right collapsed, and it was the end of the Hungarians. But in this case, they succeeded. So Poles still use this imagery. LOT Airlines sometimes still uses this imagery. Here, we'll go back this way. This one, too, will give somebody besides Mary a chance, but we can give her a chance, too. Anybody know the iconography on this poster? This is another W.T. Benda poster. Every Pole, even now, will recognize, well, probably not every Pole, that may be an exaggeration, but particularly older Poles will immediately recognize the iconography in this picture. After, when in August 23rd and 24th, Hitler and Stalin cut a deal to cut Poland in half before the invasion took place. So almost everything west of the Vistula River was to go to the Russians. So when the Germans invaded on September 1st, 1939, they're moving forward. The Poles think the army's going to retreat across the Vistula, set up, and it'll be a long enough war. This is, not going to happen, but they think then that'll give the time for the British and the French to come to their rescue. But in fact, the Russians have agreed to come in from the east, and on September 17th, they invade from the east. And they capture tremendous numbers of Poles, lots of whom are deported to inside the Soviet Union. In 1942, Stalin agreed to release them in central Russia, and they walked all the way to Iran. And this is the diaspora of the Polish coming out of Russia in 1942 after they've been released by Stalin. The 15,000 Polish officers all had their hands tied behind their back and their brains blown out at Katyn. So the Polish officers, that were also the reason, too, for killing the Polish officers. They were mostly reserve officers, and therefore the creme de la creme of the bourgeois, doctors, dentists, and killing them would be easier for a later takeover, which is exactly what happened. This also is Benda. The posters I showed you so far by Benda don't really, they're good in the iconography. Well, here, you can see it here in a way. The woman in front is beautiful. Benda loves beautiful women, and it's a carryover from World War I, the Gibson girls. How many of you know the Chandler posters, the Christie posters from World War I? The famous one of the girl that wants to join the Navy. All of you know that poster? I probably should have brought it. But there's a whole bunch of them that were recruiting posters that used beautiful women. Christie did, Gibson did, and so did Benda in World War I. So you can see here. You can see here, too, beautiful women. And then he used all the way through with all of his posters quotes from the Bible. I wanted to show you these two photographs. I love these photographs. They have never been published before. I got them out of the Polish Museum of America in Chicago. These are Poles that escaped out of Romania after the army retreated into Romania and into Hungary, and escaped to France and then went to England and to Canada to train. And these are young Poles that have come to Chicago to have parties with Polish girls in Chicago. And they seem to be getting along very well. But I think it's a beautiful picture. It's one of my favorites. Here they are, same party. And it's in the same building where the Polish Museum of America still is in Chicago on North Milwaukee. If you go to Chicago, they have beautiful exhibits, and if you have any interest in East European history, it's a good place to go. But they seem to be having a very good time. This, of course, is a Hoover poster for Finnish Relief, and of course the Russo-Finnish War started on November 30th, 1939, and ended on March 12th, 1940. But of course they fought valiantly all during the winter, and they became the darlings of Western Europeans and the darlings of Americans. There are probably no Americans in the winter of 1939, very few, that did not either ice skate or dance or knit or do every kind of imaginable activity, carnivals, to help the gallant Finns in their struggle against the Red Goliath. You get the idea. And of course, the image of them on their skis and in their winter capes is a powerful one. The Finns did well for a while, but you know the Russians had used second troops from the Leningrad district and not used their first-rate troops, and the Finns did very well for quite a while. And then in early January, the Russians called up their best units, and you know it was inevitable what was going to happen, which it did. Anybody know who this is? Mary. We used this, didn't we? We used this photograph. Helen Hayes. But you know what I'm really curious about? Where do you think that photograph was taken? I mean, she's got to be living in a glorious mansion somewhere. You think this might have been in the film studio or somewhere? But anyway, you know, it's on the Finnish Relief side here, Madison Square Garden. This organization, our neutrality laws were passed in 1935, which forbid us loaning money, sending any arms to any country in the world, or traveling on any ships that were belligerents. You know, you want to avoid the Lusitania that had happened in World War I. And then it was, Roosevelt got revision of the neutrality laws in 1939, but it still forbade the export of any arms and ammunition to other countries. It did provide cash and carry. In other words, anybody that could come here could buy arms as long as they could get here and take them back. Well, of course, German submarines put a dent in that policy. And the British and the French stood a better chance of getting it, but not much for the Finns. Roosevelt did all kinds of illegal things to help the Finns, didn't get caught, and then decided he better not do it again. But the name of the game was to sell them agricultural surplus, which they needed like they needed a hole in their head. So we sold them $10 million worth of, which is a lot of money in those days, of agricultural surplus. But it was bought immediately by the Swedes, who then gave the $10 million to the Finns to buy arms and ammunition. So, you know, Iran-Contra, there's nothing new in the world about the kinds of arms deals that go on in the world. But this organization tried to raise arms and ammunition directly for Finland. You could buy anything from one bullet to an airplane. And supposedly it would get there. Roosevelt also decommissioned, quote unquote, some of our first-class fighter jets on the they're not jets, but propellers. They were actually Buffalo Brewsters, and had them flowing off the decks of the Saratoga aircraft carrier in New York Harbor. They flew to Iceland, and Swedish pilots picked them up and flew them to Finland, and then just somehow they ended up going to Finland. This is really fascinating. They got there in early March. And so they ended up, because after the first Finnish War, the Finns sided with the Germans. So that in fact the planes flew in the Finnish Air Force against the Russians, who were now our allies. It's a complicated world, isn't it? It's a funny. But this organization lasted maybe 60 days. Warden Wood, who's a famous illustrator, did this poster. It's a very rare poster. Now, I should really, I should say something about really rare posters. They're really rare, but the question is, who besides me wants them? I mean, there's not a lot of market sometimes, even though they're very rare. This is McClelland Barclay. He's another famous illustrator. He did this for Belgium Relief, which is another Hoover operation to try to get aid and feed the Belgians like he'd done in World War I. Again, the blockade prevents that, and it's unsuccessful, except helping some Belgian refugees who managed to flee in front of the Germans and get out through Spain and Portugal and end up in other places. But here you'll like this. Here's McClelland Barclay showing off his artwork and his poster for the organization. Notice, too, the Belgian Relief Fund that he painted at the top is not, they put it at the bottom in this poster. So, you know, they can mess around and do lots of things with the various posters. This is the only World War II poster that Grant Wood did. And he did it for Bundles for Britain. I've always been fond of. Notice, too, that Grant Wood is not up on the latest aircraft. He and W.T. Benda share a sort of outdated mode about what bombers and aircraft are really like during this period. I've always liked this poster. A woman in New York City, a socialite by the name of Walls Lantham, started Bundles for Britain in late 1939 and always competed with British War Relief Society. They didn't like each other, although in Great Britain, Mrs. Churchill, Clementine Churchill, was very partial towards Bundles for Britain. This is her with Governor Lehman's wife in New York, admiring the poster, admiring Grant Wood's work and their famous poster. Literally tens of thousands of American women knitted for Bundles for Britain. Anybody? There is one of the bundles. We put one of the bundles in the show, didn't we, in the traveling show? I think we did, Mary. Anybody know who this movie star is? Who? You're right. It's Merle Oberon. A lot of you might not know who she is. She's a very famous. But look, she's with other women who some are, reasonably attractive, but you can tell she's definitely a Hollywood star. Look, I know. In fact, it's depressing. No, I'm just teasing you. How can you be so gorgeous? But in any event, this, of course, is British War Relief Society. They were extremely popular in America, and they manufactured every kind of thing you could imagine, everything from ashtrays to pencils to matches to posters to hats to bags, and had a big office in downtown New York City. Frank Riley, who did this poster, did one too for aid to Luxembourg, although Luxembourg never did get much aid until the very end of the war. But, we've been concerned about, I was kind of teasing about Russian intervention in our elections. The British intervened in our election in 1940 big time, way more than the Russians ever intervened. And they had all kinds of people that were American newspaper men that were on their team, and they would write the stories and feed them to the American press. They did everything they could to get Franklin Roosevelt reelected. There's some good work been done on that in the last several years. The Russian incursions have now started a historical scramble to find out who intervened in our elections, as you could guess. I'm waiting to see if the Russians intervened in the election of 1860. Now, you know I'm teasing you. But we're going to find out about a lot more about foreign intervention in American elections. This is by Jean Carlu. This would have been a beautiful poster, but it never was made as a poster. This is actually a maquette. I have this, but it's the original painting for the poster. We put this in the show, didn't we? I think I have to check with Mary all the time to make sure what actually went out on the show. But he did a bigger painting up for it too, but you can tell it's before 1942 because no National War Fund. We did, I should hedge just a little bit, that we did do a little bit of aid for Vichy France. And I remember we recognized Vichy, which was greatly criticized, but I found a document in the British archives that I'll publish in the new book that people have missed in the Roosevelt-Churchill correspondence. And there was a little note that was on back of one of the files, because, people have really been through this. And I didn't discover it. It was pure accident. It's not like, but it's a small telegram from Roosevelt to Churchill. And it says, it's from Churchill. It says, you work the Vichy side of the street, I'll work the Free French side of the street, and we'll coordinate our efforts. Which is really pretty interesting. So we did recognize Vichy. We did want to decouple them from the Germans as much as possible, so we did some vitamin milk for children. With Franco during the war, we did a little gasoline to try to keep him decoupled enough that he wouldn't go, full throttle on the German side. Although 400,000 Spaniards fought on the Eastern Front in the Waffen-SS Blue Division, and we could talk about that later. I've never been able to find this artist Eric. This is an early one too, where there were lots of French relief agencies popped up, and then they unified into one too, but they didn't have a big budget during the war. But I've always been fond of these two posters. This is by a different artist from this same period about French relief. This poster, there are about a half a dozen Lithuanian relief posters during the war. This is an early one. The only place I know this exists is in the Balzakas Lithuanian Museum in South Chicago, down in Bridgeport. Another thing you could do in Chicago, I don't know if you like Lithuanian food, or if you've even had Lithuanian food, but the community there is still reasonably intact, and the museum is very good on Lithuanian history. They had two pilots in 1934 that tried to fly the Atlantic, Darius and Gidenas. I did an article for British History Today on those two pilots because I'd been to Lithuania to do research. Well, I've done research on this subject in Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Germany, Canada, Hong Kong, and the U.S. This, now see, is National War Fund. This is a postcard and a poster and a window card. Now, America First Committee. Some people argue that there's been 4 times we've really been divided in American history. One, the 1850s. And since this is Kansas, we were at war here in Kansas a long time before the nation was actually at war. Then the intervention to World War I was a 2-year run-up that was a knockdown, drag-out debate. The debate to go into World War II between 31 and 41, some historians argue, was nastier than the 1960s. That families split, people wouldn't talk to each other. I mean, you were an interventionist or you were an anti-interventionist. Then, of course, the 1960s, and then again now. Some people say, too, the most divided time was 1788 and 1789 and the Whiskey Rebellion. So maybe we've always been maybe democracy is always a hotly defended, how about this, a free-for-all. That democracy is, by definition, an endless free-for-all, because I think it's probably true. But anyway, some people claim, historians claim that 39 to 41 is, in fact, the worst. This is the America First Committee. Here is its opposite. And this is run by the Committee to Defend America Against the Allies. Anybody know who ran it? He's from Emporia, Kansas. William Allen White. William Allen White ran this committee. And, of course, he was also Book of the Month Club. He and Elliott Roosevelt basically ran the Book of the Month. Not Elliott Roosevelt. Theodore Jr. Ran Book of the Month Club. Look at, here we get, here's Flag at his best. No, I don't know. Showing off his poster. I like this. He did a lot of these different ones. What I try to do is every time I find a poster, I try to find pictures of it in action. And sometimes for me, it's fun. But I manage to do it most of the time. But I probably looked at thousands and thousands of photographs to find them. But I'm very fond of this one. Now, this is John Falter. He's from Nebraska, small town. He also graduated from the Art Institute in 1928. I've finally gotten the Art Institute to do something about Mr. Falter. He did 60 covers for Post magazine, and he's one of the most famous poster makers of World War II. We don't do enough at the Art Institute either with Thomas Hart Benton, who also taught there at the same time. But nonetheless, he didn't teach there when Falter was there. But anyway, this is probably one of Falter's more powerful posters. When he was in high school, he illustrated his high school yearbook, and his dad wasn't sure he should be an artist. This is in the 1920s, so he called up Ding Darling, who was the cartoonist for the Des Moines Register. And Ding said, bring the boy up. So they got in the car in Nebraska and drove to Des Moines, and Ding Darling looked over all his work. And he said, I'm making this up, I don't really know. I know what he said in a secondary way, but send the boy to the Kansas City Art Institute. And he did, and he went with several of his friends, and then they became famous illustrators in New Rochelle, New York. And later, the chairman of the department, Monty Crew, quit his job and joined them. And all five of them became pulp fiction artists and poster artists and illustrators in New York City. This, again, is back to Rockwell Kent. I'm very fond of this poster. The only place I know this exists is in the Butler Library at Columbia University. And they don't care about their posters, so they have them all folded up and in big folios. It's just atrocious. And I keep telling them, you guys have got $1 billion endowment. You need to do something. Well. But, you know, a lot of people don't care about their poster collections. But I think this is a really good. That's a Vachel Lindsay poem on the bottom. Okay, here we go. This is all kinds of for Russian relief. And, of course, this is from New York City, and New York City is much more liberal and leftist. They went big for the Spanish Civil War, and they went big for Russian relief. But this is a classic, I think, 1940s big band kind of poster. This one, too, comes from, this one is from the archives in New York University. They have the complete archives from the American Communist Party and from the American Socialist Party. So the best place to get good posters on this side of things is at NYU. I like this poster too because millions, literally millions of American women sewed, knitted, did everything you could imaginable, making things for all of the different relief agencies. What I like about this poster too, it's sort of a harbinger of the new international style in posters. It's a photo montage. It's simple in design and bold in its presentation, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if you'll end up liking the new internationalism in posters that dominates the 1950s before the 60s, where there's a real change again, a sea change in poster making. But I think you'll enjoy that. Cinderellas were very popular from all the relief agencies. I just brought this one as well because it deals with Lidice, and that was the town in the Czech Republic that the Germans totally exterminated everything in the town, including all the animals, sent the children to Germany to be adopted, and then burned and destroyed the entire town, plowed it up, and salted the earth. Because supposedly one of the people that killed Heydrich, that assassinated Heydrich in Prague, was from the village of Lidice. Maybe, maybe not. They did 2 villages that they thought. The people that did it, that did the assassination, were British SOE, and they were parachuted into Prague, and they eventually hid in a church in Prague, and the Germans didn't want to violate the sanctity of the church, so they were in the basement, so they sealed the windows, sealed the doors, flooded it, and drowned them in the basement of the church in Prague. I've been to Lidice on several occasions, where it's a memorial now. This is a cheerier thing. Howard Scott was the face of the USO. And, of course, the USO was part of the National War Fund and took care of American soldiers and stars, movie stars everywhere. Bob Hope went with the National War Fund. This is our classic image of World War II. You know, the men and the women are beautiful and heroic. This poster, I think, has real nostalgia in that sense. I'm very fond. I do not own this poster. I have never seen a copy for sale. I would probably jump on it if given the chance. Who's the star? The photograph's owned by the Wall Street Journal, and I don't have the code to get of it. I've applied for the code. I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, but I need to get into their archive to find out. But it's a star. But, you know, the jitterbug was the rage, dance. And all the USOs had dances and jitterbug contests all over the world. Because, you know, I guess there's always been the argument that America's coming out party, America's bar mitzvah, was the Great White Fleet under Teddy Roosevelt. But I've never been persuaded of that. I've always been persuaded that the beginning of the American century is June 6, 1944. That's the real beginning of the American century. We can get historians in here that will argue with me about it, but I think I can hold my ground on that argument. This is from American Field Service, and they did some work in World War II, but they were really big in World War I. This one is also a pretty rare poster, and Clifton Faber was a famous illustrator that did 4 posters for them, but they were one of the smaller groups in the United War Fund. This, too, is by a famous Coffer McKnight, who was one of the famous illustrators in World War II. Did this War Prisoners' Aid, and he did quite a few for Greek relief during the war as well. I've always been quite fond of this poster. I don't own it. There's one I'm going to bid on the internet. Oh, I shouldn't have told you. You'll now outbid me. It's up at a reasonable price. This poster usually sells for $500 or $600, and there's one up at around 130 or 40 that's not been folded. Now you're going to run out. Great, get it on your phone. All right. Always been fond of American Relief for Holland, and at the end of the war, during the winter of 44, 45, the Dutch were starving. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? 5 minutes? Okay, because these are complicated stories. During Operation Market Garden, next year's the anniversary, and my daughter's married to a Dutchman and live in Eindhoven, and I'm going to go over for the Operation Market Garden reunion. I don't know why, since it was a dismal failure as an operation, but southern Holland was liberated. But during the invasion or the liberation of southern Holland by Canadians and Americans, the Dutch railroad went on strike. And they stayed on strike after Market Garden. And the Germans said, okay, we're cutting off your food. And they did, and they would not relent. So by January, December and January, people are dying of starvation. Bodies are being stacked up. Wood's being cut out of all the houses. Most of the tulip bulbs in Holland were eaten, along with the sugar beets. It gets to be nasty. We finally decided to intervene in late April of 1945, almost at the end. The cavalry arrives almost as the fort's on fire, to put it that way. Blaskowitz was the general in command, and Blaskowitz was a general who'd gotten himself, German general, had gotten himself in trouble with Hitler on several occasions, and Poland in 1939 for complaining about executing prisoners and Jews, and ended up for a long time in charge of munitions work in Munich, but then he was a good general and brought back. And Hitler's private lawyer was the Reichscommander. They both negotiated between Hitler's back and agreed that we could drop food bombs on Holland in late April and early May at designated airfields. They promised not to shoot down American aircraft. We experimented for a month before on food bombs that wouldn't break. And then we dropped millions of ration packages over about a week period in late April and early May to prevent the complete starvation of Holland. Amazingly, I've done several articles and an article for a book that was published here at KU on Dutch hunger. But in the archives at the Hoover Institution, there's all kinds of pictures that children drew about dropping the food bombs and sending them to the U.S. In almost every single picture, there are pictures of people, the little kids do pictures of people who were hit by food bombs. There's little pictures of ambulances and them being carried off because they rushed out onto the field. They were so hungry, and there's no parachutes on these. They're just being kicked out of Lancasters and kicked out of, all right. And so, there's some people, I haven't found out how many people might have been killed on May 1st, 1945 by a food bomb. But that almost seems incredibly ironic. Never mind. All right, you get the idea. All right, this is for Danish Relief. Was never a big part of the National War Fund, but in fact the Danes, and some of you may not know, but 2 of the islands in Denmark were captured by the Russians as the Russian army moved forward. And so the Cold War in Denmark really starts early. Now, we're almost done. I thought we've talked about the relief organizations. We should say this. They raised eventually, by 1946, $320 million. But I thought you should see who got the aid. This is a famous picture by Julius Bryan that was taken in Warsaw probably September 2nd or 3rd, 1939. These are Finnish children that are being evacuated from Karelia, that's now part of the Soviet Union at the end of the Russo-Finnish War in March 11th and 12th, 1945. This is a pathetic picture of a Chinese orphan that just have tags. Recent scholarship demonstrates the Japanese killed, number-wise, not the same way, as many people as the Germans killed in Europe. It's been an ignored topic till the last 7 or 8 years, and finally we're getting to the bottom of it. You know, part of the problem with the Japanese during the war is they like to start with Hiroshima and Nagasaki because that makes them victims. And research earlier, you know, the Kempei Tai, the Japanese secret police archives are still almost impossible to get into. So, you know, you want to know more about the 1930s. You know that. You want to know more about the occupation of the countries in Southeast Asia. It's a difficult topic, but there's been some excellent work done on it. These are British orphan children from the Blitz because the Germans bombed heavily. You know, they bombed all the way to Swansea, clear over into Wales. So a lot of cities in Great Britain, besides London, were hit hard by the German Air Force, and lots of refugees. These are in better shape because it's Britain and more easy to get food to. This is a refugee child. I'm not sure where it was taken. It's not a great photograph, but it's so pathetic and heartbreaking, I wanted to include it. These are Dutch children in March of 1945. There are some historians who've argued there was no hunger winter in Holland. Well, the answer to that question is BS. Look, these are Dutch children. March and April 1945, the war's almost over. And then, I think there should be one more in there. Maybe it didn't get loaded. That's a shame. Maybe I failed to load it. I'm sure that I had a picture of the Greek children, which is just terrible. I wanted to show this at the very end, and then we can ask some questions. This is the introduction, the panel, one of the text panels for the show, Work, Fight, Give, that's in Texas right now. But Mary did the design, and Mary and I and Tim Brown worked intensely on these traveling poster shows. They took us 2 to 4 years each to put together. I wrote all the text panels under the guidance of Tim, who said, "You've only got 30 words, Hal, and as you can tell today, I'm not good with 30 words." And we wrote the text panels, but I love the design she did and the way she did with the photographs, so thank you, Mary. I appreciate it. Questions? Comments? Anything you want to ask? Please, sir.
How do you get relief behind enemy lines?
You don't very well, but you know, I'll tell you what, depending, I mean, there's a big controversy, you know, about whether or not Hitler really wanted to negotiate with the British after the Poles were conquered. I think the best evidence is no. If you look at not what he said, but what he did, because on September 3rd, as he was invading Poland, he ordered 1,500 new Ju-88s, which are purposely designed to raid Great Britain. I think it's probably mostly talk. But because they wanted to improve their image, they let Hoover eventually do some aid in Poland under German occupation. So by February of 1940, there are soup kitchens in all the major cities in Poland, including the Warsaw Ghetto, because Americans refused to discriminate against Jews. The German attitude was, it's fine to feed the Jews. It doesn't matter because we're going to kill them all anyway. I mean, that sounds horrible, but why not, for propaganda purposes, you know, allow them, Americans, to feed them? So there was a little bit of aid that got, you know, like Greece, again, occupied, a little bit to Poland, a little bit to Belgium, and essentially that's it. But yes, Hoover had done it very successfully in World War I and fed the Belgians for 4 years in northern France under German occupation. But World War II is a horse of a different color. Questions? Anything else? Please.
I don't know. Did you see, he can hear me. He can hear me. Did you see the PBS special here a while back, Jews in the American forces during World War II?
Yes,
That was
yes.
pretty telling.
It is. It's a fine documentary. Any other questions? Anybody want to ask anything? Please, yeah. Yeah, let me tell you what. The reason they're so hard to find that have not been folded is because most of them were folded by a press before they were sent out, so it was cheap to put them in an envelope and send them. The only ones that you can find that didn't were ones that were sent in rolls to headquarters in various cities to be put up. Folded ones are probably 90% of all the World War II posters.
Now, if they're not displaying them, will they ever loan it out to people?
Well, I couldn't hear you. Please.
Thank you. I should be on the
There
mic
we
too.
go.
If those that are having it that don't display it,
Right.
don't seem to do anything with it, do they ever think about loaning it out so other people can display and then return it to them?
Oh, you mean the posters themselves? Can
Yes,
they be
the
loaned out
posters.
now for display? We might be able to cut a deal. No. I mean, I think I'm trying to get Swan Auctions has agreed to sell my Obama collection, which is about 550 posters. But I want them to sell my World War II collection as well. But yes, if you wanted to do a slight exhibit here or something, yeah, we could work something out.
Thank you.
Because I mean, a lot of them are out on the road, but I probably still have 50 or 60. I'll tell you what, too, when I find them, you know, depending if I don't run out of money, but it's cheaper to get posters sent to New York to be deacidified and mounted and cleaned and repaired. Here in Kansas City, it's $300 to $400 a poster. I can get it done in New York for $100. And because I've done so much business with two people in New York, they give me a good discount. But yeah, I get them the Finnish poster with the pack on the back. It was in deplorable condition, and so I took a picture of it and sent it to my friend in New York at the restoration company and said, "Do you think you guys can do this?" And he sent back an email and said, "Yep." And they did. It just looks perfect. I could have brought a few real posters today. Any other questions? Anybody want to ask anything?
Is there a schedule for your poster tours?
Yeah, if you go to Mid-America Arts and look at, I think that Work, Fight, Give is going to be maybe next year in Learned, Kansas, at the museum in Learned. But you can get a schedule for both of the shows from Mid-America Arts. And go to exhibits, and then click on it again, and it'll show 3 pages of their traveling shows. Work, Fight, Give is on page 3, and Sign of the Times is on page 2. Work, Fight, Give will be back in Kansas City in unless somebody grabs it. It's coming back for refurb. Usually they're out for 2.5 years, and they come back for refurb. And I think 2019. January of 2019, it'll be back in downtown Kansas City. Mid-America Arts is in the Crossroads District, and they have NEH funding and work in a 5-state area, and they put together shows, both from the NEH that are done in Washington, and then local shows that are put together like people like myself and a team here, and then they go out on the road for 4 or 5 years. So at some point, I'm going to get back 110 frame posters on my front. Oh, God. Oh, God. Now, you want to be there that day because my one daughter, Allison, will put them all out at about $1.25 a piece framed. So you want to look for my impending death and then think, there's going to be a garage sale like you won't believe. Mary's going to be there. Any other questions? All right, thank you very, very much.